Good evening, welcome to the Institute, all the more for these excessively interesting times we live in, if I can put it that way. Since I started 4 months ago, people have been saying to me rather grimly, you couldn't have joined at a more interesting time. And in fact, one former colleague reminded me today of the old advice in the Foreign Office by John Boyd, an old Foreign Office hand, who used to say, if you find yourself caught up in a revolution, 3 things. First one, fill the bathtub with cold water. Second one, be sure not to be swept away by a mad politician. And third one, don't get locked in your cipher room. And while the third one is probably archaic, the second one these days in parts of the Western world perhaps is not. Anyway, can I say at the start, what a privilege and what great fun it's been to join such a talented and dedicated band of people here and to be at the Institute at this time. It seemed worth putting together a talk like this at this point for 2 reasons. The first is to comment on a year of extraordinary upheaval, which has had the Westminster bloggers complaining about too much news and has triggered all the kind of deep questions we've been dealing with about the future of democracy in the West and all the things that have occupied the past 6 months of discussion. But I wanted to say something about that wider context in which we do our work and about what that means for modern government. And then the second thing I wanted to do is say a bit about what the Institute is doing, why we're doing it, and why it matters. Valerie Amos, Baroness Amos, former Secretary of State, now Director of SOAS, who's one of our governors, said to me recently that governing a divided country is the hardest task for modern politics. And John Kerr, the peer and former diplomat, put it on this platform sitting right there, rather controversially as it proved, just a few months ago. How do you build a majority for the policies you want, not find your policies dictated by the majority? As one civil servant, a very senior one, said to me just last week, look, we're dealing with a crisis of legitimacy. We thought these pillars of democracy were taken for granted, and now we find they're in question. I'm going to talk about 4 things. Why it's a hard time to run a country, the challenge to democratic institutions, what modern government might do in response, and what we're doing at the Institute. So let me start with saying why it's a hard time to run a country. But immediately that seems a very presumptuous thing to say, looking at history, even of the past century, that has hardly been quiet. This year marks the centenary of the Battle of Passchendaele, famous not just for more than 500,000 casualties, but for the mud, a battle of which Lloyd George said, it was indeed one of the greatest disasters of the war. No soldier of any intelligence now defends this senseless campaign. Or again, would it be right to say that government now is harder than in the 1970s when government ran big chunks of the economy and almost 100 companies which are now in private hands? So in a sense, not. But all the same, it seems to me, there are aspects that do make government now unusually difficult. One is financial crisis and austerity. We're still working our way through the effects of the 2008 crisis and the anger that caused. We're dealing with austerity, even if that word is dropping out of fashion. You know, we're looking at departments still having considerable cuts. The departments, for example, for communities and local government and for transport face cuts of more than 50% in their day-to-day spending in the last 5 years. On top of that, you've got a longer history of debt, deficits and demography, if you want to add that in. These budget pressures, not just in the UK, but many of the Western democracies, have got deeper roots than the 2008 crisis, even if that attracted all the drama. It's not new to have debt and deficits, but it is new to try and do something about them with an aging population, as well as trying to preserve these deep sedimentary layers of promises that governments have made to their citizens, to their voters, particularly since the Second World War, particularly on health and pensions. And that leads to what I've called before the bonfire of the promises. Governments are having to say to people, look, you know those contracts that you thought you had with your government about health, about education, about pensions? Well, they're all being rewritten, not in your favour. And now, please vote for us again. We'll work through this too, in my view, as people become accustomed to a longer working life, the only realistic answer to some of these pressures, and indeed as we find a cure for dementia, one of the blights on the vision of how wonderful the 100-year life will be. But at the moment, these pressures on their own make it a hard time to be in democratic politics. And then on top of that, we've got these great trends of globalization, trade, immigration, which have wrought their own revolutions, if I can put it that way. Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, made the point here in our first event of the year that during years of strong growth in the national economy, not all groups have benefited equally. All right, he's not the first person to make that point, that some regions, some generations have done better than others. But his central point was that some people then have a legitimate retort when told that the country overall is doing well to say, look, no, I'm not. And his point was it makes it peculiarly hard for governments to communicate arguments about the national interest, particularly arguments, economic arguments, if I can put it that way, unless they can bring people along with that in the national interest. Globalization has also made the mechanics of government harder in some ways. For example, in the crucial business of collecting tax. If companies and individuals barely recognize national borders, it becomes much, much harder to carry out that very basic function. Moises Naim, the Venezuelan economist, in his 2013 best-selling book, The End of Power, Why Being in Charge Isn't What It Used to Be, captured this point, arguing that government's power had dissipated to companies or to individuals using the internet, to media. That brings me to the point which many, many politicians make very plaintively in this building about media and social media and the difficulties that those bring these days. One former minister put it to me recently that the media devour the announcements that we've planned for the day and then want more an hour later, while confronting politicians constantly with stories that need immediate response. And indeed now we're all being confronted with brand new planks of national security policy from the President-elect of the United States. The result of putting all these factors together is the anger and mistrust that we saw last year and that hangs over this year's elections in Europe, in Germany, France, the Netherlands, maybe Italy. There's a kind of black comedy, I think, to this year's proceedings in Davos, which kicked off yesterday. Even though stock markets are booming, the global economy doing better, and the risks of a sharp China slowdown arguably less, world leaders are grappling with a mood that they call unprecedented. That mood is nationalism, arguing that we should shut out the problem. It's populism, offering appealing solutions that may embrace all kinds of apparently contradictory positions. It's also the evolution of partisan worlds built on selective truth. Barack Obama made this a target of his final speech in Chicago on Tuesday last week. He warned that American democracy was under threat from a basic lack of solidarity among its citizens. Even though he'd averted an even deeper recession, rescued the car industry, created jobs, he noted the rise of naked partisanship, increasing economic and regional stratification, the splintering of our media into a channel for every taste. Increasingly, he said, we become so secure in our bubbles that we accept only information, whether true or not, that fits our opinions, instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that's out there. I think that would have a lot of echoes here. I've been talking mainly so far about the shudders passing through economics and politics, but let me say something briefly about why Iraq still resonates so much in this context. It's not just a story about US military might confounded, though it was obviously that. And for the UK, it's not the worst recent decision of that kind. In my view, Britain's shockingly casual decision to take military forces into Afghanistan, into the Helmand province in 2006, and at the same time to take on responsibility for combating the country's drug trade, was a stupider mistake. We knew more and should have considered more about the risks and the forces that might be needed. But Iraq has rightly been more damaging to Western democracy and its global reputation. It told us that our political system was less appealing than we thought and much less easily exported. It told us much more than we wanted to know about its frailty, that you needed institutions with deep roots and a shared willingness to protect the losing side if you're not going to create a brutal winner-takes-all kind of contest. I had dinner with Vladimir Putin at his residence in 2007, just as Iraq was going indisputably wrong. And what was most of interest, beyond his determination to win every verbal point, was his view that Iraq would be the moment when the US retreated to become a regional, not a global power. So that brings me to my second overall point, the challenge to the institutions of democracy themselves. The Supreme Court ruling on Brexit, which we expect this month, goes to the heart of this, pronouncing whether the government must consult Parliament before triggering Article 50. So we've had notoriously the spectacle of the Daily Mail telling the world that High Court judges were enemies of the people for saying that Parliament should have a role. We've also had Jeremy Wright, the Attorney General, telling the court that despite all appearances, the use of the royal prerogative for executive actions is not an ancient relic of outdated laws, but a crucial part of the modern state's powers. By committing herself to putting a final Brexit deal before both houses of Parliament, Theresa May yesterday shut down, effectively, one flank of the controversy, but still left unresolved the status of the referendum in a parliamentary system. And the question isn't so much whether the courts can pronounce on these wrinkles in our unwritten constitution, clearly they can, but whether people will accept the verdict. One civil servant with a front row seat on this said to me, "We talk about rule of law as a fundamental British value, but what about when it comes up against other ideologies? Is it really as fundamental as we think?" The new mood is intolerant of representative democracy, which is partly why we had a referendum in the first place. The now routine description of MPs as part of a political elite is, I think, disturbing. They are elected representatives who say to us, obviously very plaintively, look, we spend a lot of time with our constituents. But these are just aspects of the wider challenge to institutions that we've taken for granted for a long time. Mainstream political parties are disintegrating. Their concerns aren't mapping well onto those of voters. The standing of traditional media is under attack from public and politicians, as well as rivals and social media, as well as the lack of a business plan. In the US, the principle that both parties at least tried in Congress to keep government going has been a casualty of the last decade. And now we've got the president-elect's war of choice with the intelligence agencies, and an outright challenge from a distinguished congressman that Trump is an illegitimate president if Russia put him there. This is something of a bitter result after a quarter of a century of peace and a fair amount of prosperity, at what was thought to be the end of history, liberal capitalism supposedly having won the Cold War. It raises the question of whether democracies can still solve their own problems. The answer, it seems to me, is yes, that they can, but only if politicians can overcome divisions to command a majority for the changes they want to make. They can't if one side rejects the legitimacy of the other and of the institutions of democracy themselves. And that does mean being able to argue for a direction of travel and to persuade people to go along. If instead we are in an age of unreason, to quote what seems to be the working title of the book that George Osborne is writing, then anyone attempting to lead a country through this thicket of problems can't win by argument. We're then in an era of mythology, of romantic notions about nations, of claims, not facts. So what should be done about this? On a more positive note, people are beginning to suggest ways to do government differently, to protect a country's governability. Many of these suggestions are exploratory, playing with ideas. Others take a new, hard look at old problems. In discussing them, I'm not saying that I or the Institute embrace all of them, but you can hear the start of a more upbeat, if experimental, discussion about how government can improve and also how government can strengthen the case for its own legitimacy. Let's come back to that notion of John Kerr's. How do you forge a majority for a policy, not forge policies to suit the majority? How do you bridge these divisions? Theresa May's shared society, which she floated in the new year, is a potentially interesting notion, likely to have been more substantial, I think, if she hadn't had Brexit to navigate. But what might a government then need to do? There's new techniques it might deploy, and then there's ways it might change the whole approach to making policy, to arrive at something more fitting for a 21st century country. Well, a start would be to acknowledge the problem. Government needs to acknowledge when people have lost out or been left behind. It does absolutely nothing to foster faith in government, to deny flatly that some people or regions may have been hard hit by change. And equally, government needs to get better at having what is sometimes blithely called a public conversation when it wants people to face up to inconvenient truths, such as the cost of the NHS. The Brexit debate was not a good advertisement, I don't think anyone could say, for skill in getting a message across. Second point, well, it needs to demonstrate competence. This might seem a very workaday point, but it isn't. It is the bare minimum that voters feel entitled to expect, even if they are repeatedly sound not surprised when they are let down on that front. Mistakes are deeply damaging to public trust, not just on the grand scale like Iraq or the black comedy of the £286 million airport on the island of St Helena, too windy to receive any flights. Matthew Paris wrote in the Times in December, "Stratospheric blunders cost us billions, while at street level, useless officials or low caliber service sap output and demoralize the people who try harder." It might seem odd to make a link then from competence to digital government, but nonetheless, my third point is to develop digital government. We published a report led by Daniel Thornton here some months ago on how government can do this better and how we are actually working our way away from the disasters of the past. And though people get messianic about this, the core point is that it dangles not just the hope of government making government cheaper, which gets a whole section of the civil service very excited, but more interestingly, it enables people to deal with their governments differently, to have a smoother, faster way of not just small points like getting driving licenses and passports more easily, but actually to get medical advice, to deal with their MPs. One MP told me he was crowdsourcing his manifesto from email conversations with constituents. Another point you hear a lot about now, developing skill-informing coalitions. We don't have a coalition government now in Westminster, although they are commonplace in local government. But we might well again, because political allegiances are continuing to shift and the parties are not managing well to, as I said, to capture their old bases. Many issues are going to need cross-party support in Parliament, and select committees are getting increasingly sure-footed and effective at fostering this. And another one, again, hearing more and more about with a lot more energy, explore the potential of cities and regions, not just as a way of devolving power, though there is more energy behind that, but using them as testing grounds for new ideas and ways of governing. There's been fitful but increasingly serious commitments to this change. So these are techniques of government which you hear a lot of discussion about now, about how this might change. They sound abstract, but actually people are doing them on the ground. And then there are sizable areas where the whole way in which policy is made may need to change. One the government has picked for itself is industrial strategy. We still don't really know what Theresa May means by this, and it's a phrase that governments love to utter. But we should welcome any serious attempt to sort out the tangle of thinking on infrastructure, financing, risk and rates of return, foreign ownership, energy, skills, executive pay. Another is our tax system, which again is getting more and more comment that it just is not delivering what we need in the 21st century. It's complex, it's heavy-handed, and the drama and secrecy, or these days mock secrecy, around the budget means that it gets none of the scrutiny that other areas do. The growing chorus arguing that partly because of this, the tax code is really failing to keep pace with big social changes, the rise of the self-employed, people working later in life, as they're going to have to. And so let me come on to my last point about what the Institute is doing. I've talked about the context in which we're working, new difficulties for government, new thinking about how that changes political leadership and government. The Institute's mission is to make government more effective, to make it work better. We focus on the machinery of government, on how it's done, but that covers a lot. Much of this is technical, but we do it in an awareness of that wider context and of the need that brings sometimes for deep cultural change. There is a view, which you find sometimes in well-sheltered pockets of British government, that government is a machine to be perfected, and politics the nuisance that crashes in to disrupt this. That attitude reminds me of my favourite ever piece of promotional material sent by the Saudi government to the FT when I was working there. boasting that the kingdom had achieved decades of what it called progress without change. You can't make that joke anymore about Saudi Arabia. There's plenty of change now, which may or may not amount to progress. But you can, unfortunately, make it about parts of British government. And yet it's not an attitude that can afford to survive. It matters that the relationships between different parts of government work well and lend themselves to accountability and to change. How ministers work with the civil service, how they both work with Parliament, how departments manage public bodies, how all of these build public support. These are parts of running a modern government. And these have been at the core of the Institute's work since the beginning 9 years ago. That we do this by research, by comment, by large public events, by high-level private discussions. We've got a broad, rich programme of work, much too big to recount here. But let me pick out 3 things that are priorities for this year. The first one is Whitehall. Accountability is the theme that's run through all our work about the relationships between different parts of government. And Whitehall Monitor is our almanac compiled by Gavin Freegard and his team, published later this month. And then we have Performance Tracker, a new study led by Julian McRae, published at the end of February. And these 2 documents are the way that we judge government performance in numbers. We're also doing a lot of work on professionalisation of the civil service. This is a long-standing Institute theme, clearly worth pursuing. And the aim is to get right away from the culture of the bright generalist, which has been such a feature of British government, and to make sure that on some areas, for example, finance, commercial, digital, and policy making, that the people doing that really know what they're doing. And so the second area, is policy making itself. A big area, but we really want to look at how it is done, how it could be made better. We're looking at what goes wrong both in the process and in the thinking. When I took this job, John Kay, the economist, said to me, "So many of these decisions are a catastrophe of process." We were talking about the Hinkley Power Station, Heathrow and HS2 at the time, but the point applies to many areas, or as one civil servant put it to me rather bleakly, right people making bad decisions repeatedly. On Monday, we published a report on making tax policy better, led by Jill Rutter, and we're delighted that the Chancellor has already accepted an early recommendation from this team, which is to have only 1 budget event a year, not 2. And in 3 weeks' time, we'll bring out a report led by Emma Norris called All Change, about the calamitous tendency in Britain for constantly reinventing the same policies. This churn is particularly marked in 3 areas which are absolutely central to productivity and therefore to the country's future. Further education, industrial policy, regional policy. In further education alone, I'll just give you 1 fact from this, but the graphics in this report tell the whole story. Since the 1980s, there have been 28 acts and 48 secretaries of state, while no organisation has lasted more than a decade. And the third area, a big priority for this year, is Brexit. In a way, this is the biggest challenge. It brings all these points that I've been talking about together and is now a substantial programme of work for us in itself, led at first by Hannah White and now by Jill Rutter. It's technically difficult and it's politically formidable. It's trying to sell a single version of Brexit to a country that had only a narrow majority for the principle overall, not for any one version of that. The IfG starts from the question, how can you make this work better, and then takes a very hard look at the state of preparedness and how to pursue negotiations. And the state of preparedness is better than you might think from many reports we've found. The task of describing the impact and the opportunities is well underway. I think some of the reports have been much too pessimistic on that. But less so on planning for the negotiation, perhaps, and it will be a negotiation. The central point that Ivan Rogers made before he stepped down as the UK's permanent representative to the EU is that it is a curiously British view, rational and transactional, to think that the other 27 countries will gravitate somehow to a win-win outcome. There are just too many interests in play for that. I thought the Prime Minister's speech yesterday guilty of wishful thinking on that point. On the other hand, she has a point, it seems to me, more than she's often credited with, in saying that she's going to keep the negotiating position to herself right to the end. But there are then consequences of taking that stand. If you take one example I found very powerful, take the example of the borders and how people are going to cross them 731 days after Article 50 is triggered. Civil servants say to us with some force that if they're going to apply the same scrutiny to Europeans that they do currently to Americans, they're going to need 3 times the resources because that's the number of extra arrivals that they're going to have to monitor. On the other hand, if they're going to digitize it all and hope, at least, to do it more cheaply that way and with fewer people, they're going to have to start right now, and even so it's going to take ages. And if they're not going to know what to do until negotiations are concluded, then the inescapable implication is that they're going to need more time, a way of continuing the status quo beyond those first 2 years. I'm not even talking about an interim deal, just a way of keeping the status quo going. And that's a message we hear from a lot. Occasionally I think that Brexit is the epitome of tediousness. It's 10 years' work, and that estimate is entirely plausible for people who had plenty of other worthwhile ways of spending those 10 years. But more often I think it's a revolution that's going to change us in ways that we can barely judge at this point. As one civil servant put it to me last week, in 42 years we've absorbed Europe deep, deep into our constitution, and we're struggling even to describe the reach of EU law into our own law. Let me just make a few points in conclusion. What I've been talking about is that one of the greatest tasks of modern government is to command support for its chosen policies despite the current mood of challenge, skepticism, contempt, disbelief. And so, first, at the very least, government has to be more professional, more accountable, smarter and more competent, and be seen to be that, be able to demonstrate to people that it is those things. Beyond that, it needs to bridge the divisions in the country with its policies, but also with its techniques for speaking to people in order to build coalitions to reach a majority. And above all, it needs to make again the case for benefits of progress, for economic growth, for government itself, and for its legitimacy. I don't mean for big government or small government, but for government's right and responsibility to address the country's problems and attempt to lead it forwards. There is an urgency about this. After the last 6 months, it might be tempting to treat 2016 as a watershed. It's always tempting to think that the time that we're in is a turning point, but that's usually a fallacy. What we've seen may just be the beginning. We've yet to face, for example, any significant erosion of middle-class jobs by technology, but that will probably come and change our politics again. We've yet to face successful challenge to the Union of the UK, but that may come. But government has achieved a lot, even in just this quarter of a century I've been talking about since the Berlin Wall fell. We're more open, we're more prosperous, we've embraced a digital revolution, but we're also more divided, and that makes the task of modern democratic leadership much harder. Successive governments have been much too casual about these divisions, provided that they could demonstrate economic growth, though I would be very reluctant for them now to try to bridge these divisions in a way that was too casual about that growth, as is the danger of some versions of Brexit. But what's clear is that they now need to answer them in a way that makes, once again, even though we thought the argument was won a long time ago, the case for the legitimacy of government itself. Thanks very much.